everybody, to Word for Word. We're joined today by Dr. Jeremy Heider. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, so, a few months back we talked together in a project I was doing kind of as a perspective of the things coming about, things happening in the school year with COVID in mind. Mm-hmm. And so we were looking at some of the different things where, COVID could play out in terms of student socialization, how it was going to affect the school year and the student body. Now we've got a little bit more information in terms of, what we've seen, kind of observed. What would you say you've kind of seen in terms of how the student body has kind of gotten along with COVID in mind, with all of these safety precautions in mind, which, going into it, I kind of was wondering, well, is this going to hinder how students engage with one another and, and meet one another and, kind of build those student connections and things along the way?
Mm-hmm. I think at the time we talked a few months ago, the primary concern that we had in our conversation is the extent to which people might feel separated or isolated from one another, as opposed to having the ability to normally interact and normally socialize with other people. And we'd also talked about the idea that as human beings, we are inherently exceptionally social creatures. We crave interactions with other members of our species in ways that not necessarily every other species does. So our concern at that time was, how are people, students in particular, how are they going to approach socializing with their peers? Obviously, we have many virtual tools at our disposal that we use not only for instruction in our courses, but also informal socialization can also occur by virtual means, right? You and I could get together and hang out and, we could watch a movie together through the beauty of technology without actually being in the same location, right? But we also know that's never quite the same as actually getting together, right? In the same physical location to watch a movie or a game or whatever, or just to have a conversation, whatever the case may be. So I think there were a lot of question marks at that time, because you have these two sort of competing forces. On the one hand, you have that very, very strong human desire to connect, to interact, to socialize, and to do so in person. At the same time, you have this competing force of, I'll just call it COVID, because I think everyone will understand that pretty well, right? And the need for social distancing and being careful about who you socialize with, how often you do it, and how long you socialize, and so on, right? And so at that time, prior to the fall semester, there was really, we could do little but speculate, honestly, about how those two competing forces are going to battle with each other. People want to hang out, especially with close friends, significant others, and they want to do so in person, in close quarters, and things like that, right? You want to hug your best friend. You want to kiss your significant other. You want to be in close physical proximity with the most important people in your life. And so it was sort of a question of, is that desire for physical closeness, socialization, that desire we have as human beings, versus the COVID pressures to be more careful and engage in more separation and not go out as much and or for not as long, and so on. And so as we flash forward now, several months later, we've got a full semester under our belts of working with all of these sorts of things. And I think what we can say now, both, I would sort of mix my own observations of our student body with some formal research that social scientists have been doing the last few months. I think what we can say at this point is that a lot of people have shown a great deal of resilience in the face of this. Because one thing that we would worry about is that people being cut off from interaction and socialization with other people could put them at risk for some unfortunate mental health after effects, right? And so I believe that the technological tools we have at our disposal helped a lot of people cope with situations. I will use myself as a quick example. I know I'm not part of the student body, but I will use myself as an example. My family, we did virtual Thanksgiving and Christmas sorts of celebrations with our extended family who live in other places, as opposed to what we would normally do is go to physically visit them. And I have heard, at least anecdotally, from a number of students who did the same, or at least something similar. Maybe I've heard from some students who did entirely virtual connections with family that they might normally have visited as well. But I've heard variations on that story where maybe they did virtual Thanksgiving, but decided to actually do a physical visit for Christmas, or some variation on that theme where at some level people did do less traveling and less physical face-to-face contact than they would in any other year. So I think people, on the one hand, did a pretty good job of using virtual tools to try and keep some of those connections as active and alive as possible, while also trying to think of the best way to put this, but while also trying to engage in as much safe in-person contact as possible. Because I don't want to be too redundant here, but that's just, the virtual tools are wonderful. It is great that we have them. So when you cannot physically interact with someone in an in-person setting, the virtual option is miles ahead of no option at all. It's even better, something like a video chat with someone is even typically superior to an audio-only phone call, for example. Just being able to see other people's faces can have this important effect on the way we operate. So it's something where I think people did a pretty darn good job. And I know I'm just saying people kind of in a general sense here. I hope it's clear that applies to the students here at Southeast, the students in various institutions all over the country. I think people did a pretty darn good job of interacting in person in mostly safe ways. Again, it's totally understandable with your closest friends, your significant others, etc., that you're not going to great lengths to socially distance, right? If it's someone you live with, someone you're dating, etc., it's totally understandable. But when it comes to other forms of socialization, I think people have done a pretty darn good job of mostly, nobody's perfect, right? Mostly adhering to safety protocols while also showing resilience in terms of those mental health effects.
Just one of the other things was kind of factoring into that. You mentioned how observably students have done so well, and I know that for a lot of people, it was rather surprising that we made it through a semester totally
Absolutely.
Without being sent home. There was like these I guess folks were like betting on how quickly we'd be sent back.
Informally only,
right.
I would have, yes. No way anyone was betting any real money. No, that would never. Gambling is something that we do not condone here. So no way would anyone ever really do that.
And I hear this just anecdotally. I don't know anything firsthand.
Yeah.
Among students, you know how students are.
I would be to confess here, if I may. I would be one who I questioned the likelihood of whether we would make it through a full semester without going fully virtual. I really did, and so I am impressed, I would say, with our campus community. And we had positive cases, certainly, but thankfully they never rose to a level of such grave concern that we would need to send everyone away as we had done for the latter half of the previous semester in the spring.
Right. Yeah. So with that, folks will often associate youth with a certain rebelliousness
Yes.
or something along those lines. What do you think is kind of do you think that with students and how they have managed to keep these rules in place, what do you think it says about kind of the relationship with adhering to the rules? What does that adherence say about kind of like where students are in the midst of this pandemic and what they're thinking about it, I guess?
The ability to self-regulate increases substantially in young adulthood. So as just a point of kind of a compare and contrast sort of thing, my wife is a high school teacher. Teenagers were pretty horrible about adhering, relative to other age groups. Teenagers did not have the best track record of being careful and adhering to protocols and being safe and things of that nature. And that is, to be fair, through no fault of their own. I mean, physiologically, the adolescent brain is not quite where the young adult brain is in terms of that self-regulating quality, that willpower, impulse control, I think would be another more familiar phrase that people use a lot to describe those sorts of things. The adolescent brain is not so great at impulse control. The young adult brain, while still leaving a little bit of room for the absolute final stages of brain development, the day you turn 18, for example, or 20 out of teenage years, those days don't mark some magical milestone where you instantly go from no impulse control to perfect impulse control. So there's still a developmental trajectory going on there. But young adults have a pretty substantial self-regulatory ability compared to their adolescent counterparts who are just a handful of years younger than they are. And I think what we saw last semester at this institution and many others is a testament to that. That self-regulatory ability really takes a substantial leap forward when you progress out of adolescence into your young adult years. Because I was genuinely impressed with especially hearing stories, as I'm sure you did, about other institutions. I think it was the University of North Carolina that had somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 billion cases within the first, hyperbole of course, but they had 74 billion cases within the first 5 minutes of their fall semester. I forget the actual numbers, forgive me. But it was an alarming number of positive cases within days, literally within the first few days of their semester. And they hit the panic button pretty quickly and said, everybody go home. And so that only fuels our fears that well, might we face a similar situation? Are we going to be able to make it through a week, let alone 4 months worth of an entire semester? And we did. And I don't see any reason, even with newer concerns popping up about a new strain of COVID and things like that, I still think we have great reason to be encouraged now that we can make it through this semester safely as well.
One of the things that I have been kind of, trying to pay attention to the last several years, it seems kind of like an evolving story, which you've had psychologists weigh in on, and even I believe a senator weigh in on things like that. Is that the idea of a loneliness epidemic in in the world, in America, things like that. And so I'm kind of wondering about if you think that those two things relate. This idea of this psychological epidemic in the state that we're in, in a world flush with different technologies and things like that, and a need for a personal connection, possibly extended and strengthened or heightened by a pandemic of a physical nature?
Yeah. I think it's pretty straightforward, actually, or at least now, many months into this, and being able to look back and look at data from some really top-notch researchers who look into loneliness and depression and things like that. I think the connection there is pretty straightforward, in the sense that the so-called loneliness epidemic, as studied by loneliness researchers, those researchers have done a pretty good job of identifying risk factors for loneliness. So when someone says there's a loneliness epidemic, it just doesn't mean all people from all walks of life are suddenly more disconnected and lonely now than they were in some prior era of human existence, right? What they do mean instead is that certain pockets or categories of people who fit into certain demographics, are more prone to loneliness than others. So people who live in poverty, for example, great example of people, because of the financial struggles that they face. When you're living in poverty, you're more likely to be living in a less physically safe environment. You're more likely to have food insecurity, wondering where imagine living a life where you're wondering where your next meal may or may not come from, or even if you will have a next meal. Will I even have 3 meals throughout this day, like so many other people will enjoy the privilege of? So people who live in poverty deal with so many of those other stressors, and they might not have the luxury of free time to socialize, with friends and family, because they're trying to scrape together a life, a literal biological life, like food. They have all of those stressors surrounding them, that their physical and biological survival may be at stake. Those things have to come first. And so often the pursuit of those biological necessities, like food, don't leave much time for satisfying more psychosocial needs, like interaction and socialization with friends and family. So if you look at a category like people living in poverty as already at higher risk for loneliness, depression, anxiety, the list is kind of long, so I'll just stop there. If you look at a category like people living in poverty as already at higher risk for all of those detrimental sorts of effects, then, at least in hindsight, as we look back at the past few months, it's those same high-risk categories that were most at risk for a spike in depression, anxiety, loneliness, etc. during the pandemic. So it's basically people who were already, if not already lonely / depressed / anxious, who already had conditions in place surrounding them that could make them prone to those sorts of things. They were the most likely to fully develop or they already had those sorts of effects to have them exacerbated. People who, I guess the positive flip side of that coin is people who don't fall into those high-risk categories for loneliness and so on, were the ones who showed considerable resilience in the face of the pandemic. They've been able to cope with it better, for lack of a better way of putting it. People who weren't in those high-risk categories, people of sound financial means, for example, were much more likely to show resilience in the face of the pandemic and the distancing and all of those sorts of things. Poverty in particular, there's always a reason that one comes to mind for me first, because poverty is something that just, it puts someone in an exceptionally difficult position on so many levels. Whether it's pure physical survival to what we're talking about here today, socialization needs and things like that. it puts people in a vulnerable position for a laundry list of negative psychological effects, and it also becomes it's very cyclical. It's a cycle that's hard to break. That connection between poverty and negative mental health effects it builds upon itself, essentially.
We've been speaking about beforehand a bit with some of the news of whether or not double masking could become a thing that
Yes.
is more prevalent, is something that is recommended. And for me, looking at this, question comes to mind that, folks are adhering to the rules of masks and social distancing, in order to do their part to help stop the pandemic. Some, may be more begrudging, but might be patient with it in terms of just, things like that. Mm-hmm. And I wonder for how many people something like this, and, among students and things, what would turn into too much, probably, for students? What would break the camel's back, I think, or in general, in terms of everybody? What would be too much?
Oh, double masking might be it for a lot of people. Particularly when you consider, a mask mandate, as we have here on our campus, is relatively easy to enforce. In the sense that whether or not someone is wearing a mask is quite visible. Imagine the challenges that are posed by trying to enforce a double mask mandate. If at a glance, I look about a room of students and I see a mask covering everyone, to what extent do I know whether there's actually a second mask, underneath that first one? And so it's difficult to say how the world at large is going to react to these sorts of new suggestions, other than to say, if a divide already exists, I think the one predictable thing would be people who are already inclined to mask up and engage in social distancing are by far more likely to adhere to any additional requests or recommendations in terms of CDC or local county health departments and things like that. Because you phrased your question as how much might be too much, right? Well, it's pretty clear that single masking, I guess is what we'll call it, to compare and contrast. Single masking, many people have already made it quite clear, not necessarily here on this campus in our university community, but many people in the world at large have made it clear that even a single mask is too much, and it is something that they are not necessarily willing to do. So a significant proportion of the general population has already passed that too much. For some people, anything at all was too much. Any alteration to their normal daily routine was too much to ask of them. But I imagine the spirit of your question is more along the side of people who are already reasonably compliant. Is there some sort of breaking point for them? I don't know. For the record, I'm going to fully admit I am being totally speculative here, okay? Mm-hmm. But I suspect that the breaking point might have less to do with how much we're asking people to do, how many masks or how many feet apart or whatever. The breaking point, if there is one, might have less to do with how much we're asking people to do and more with the amount of time that we're being asked to do it. Because, COVID fatigue or whatever you want to call it, that seems to be a pretty real phenomenon as well. That even people such as myself and yourself, members of our campus community who have been, I don't know if I'd say happily compliant, but just, reasonably compliant with various safety protocols. We didn't necessarily expect roughly 10 months later, as we think back to when our our university first shut down back in March of 2020, and now we are talking in January of 21. I don't think you or I or many people out there really foresaw, and we're not done yet, right? I mean, it's not done in January of 21. We're extending throughout this semester. We are looking at, whatever the final tally may be, well over a year's worth of day-to-day activity being pretty substantially altered by this pandemic. And back, if you put your mind back into, say, mid-March 2020, about 10 months ago, did you or I or did any of us really expect that we would still be dealing with this problem well over a year into it? And I can just speak for myself. The answer's no. I mean, I, along with everyone else, thought, well, a few months, that's okay. I can deal with that. Once over the summer, it became pretty clear that we were going to have to do some substantial alterations to our routine throughout the fall semester. But even as fall got underway, we're hoping, all right, hopefully this will be the one and only semester where we have to alter our routine so dramatically, and in the spring and beyond, we can get back to normal. And that clearly didn't happen. So now the question becomes, what happens in the fall of 21? Are we still going to be dealing with the same sorts of restrictions and precautions and protocols and things like that? And so I think if there's a come back to my original point, the rambling again, I'm sorry. But to come back to my original point, I think if there's a breaking point, it might have a lot more to do with time. That just, at some point, we've been doing these things for so long that people, and just on an individual anecdotal basis, I have talked to people who have said, you know what, at this point, if I get sick, I get sick, and so be it. I can only deal, whether it's distancing, whether it's not visiting friends and family, whether it's masking, whatever it is. People have said, I can only deal with X. Fill in that blank with whatever aspect of this you can think of, but I can only deal with X for so long, and now I'm just over it. I'm going to try and return to as normal a life as I possibly can, and if I do get sick along the way, so be it. I don't know if you've heard similar sentiments from people you interact with, but I think people have just been dealing with various variations of different protocols for so long that it has become very exhausting and taxing. Yeah.
All right. I'm pretty sure that that's close to the end. Did you have any other closing thoughts that you wanted to add?
I could end by reiterating one of the most positive points I think that we've covered here today, and that is, I have been thoroughly impressed by our campus community, our willingness to engage in various safety practices to try and keep each other healthy, while recognizing that, yes, infections are going to happen. All of these steps that we take to try and protect ourselves are, at a minimum, going to minimize the amount of infections. I think the number, I don't recall the exact number from the fall semester off the top of my head, unfortunately, but whatever the exact number ended up being, it could have been dramatically higher if our campus community didn't commit itself so fully to our various safety practices. So kudos to our campus community and the student body in particular, because as you alluded to earlier, a lot of people might not trust young folks when it comes to impulse control and being able to adhere to these protocols and things like that. And I mean, we're not blind to the fact that, did social gatherings still occur throughout the fall semester? Yes, of course they did. People got together, they had parties, they did this, they did that, but on the whole, I think our campus community and our students in particular did a very impressive job of being safe and protecting one another. And that is why we did not have to go fully virtual throughout the fall, and I've got good confidence that we will not have to go fully virtual at some point during this spring semester either.
All right, thank you so much for being here today. I really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
I appreciate you inviting me to come talk with you. If you want to rename your podcast The Ramble, then that might be this might be the prime example episode.
I think I might need to go and see if I can get I don't know his name because I'm not really into the wrestling scene as much, but the guy that says, "Are you ready to rumble?" and pay him a certain amount,
Michael Buffer, yes,
to get me an intro that says, "Are you ready to ramble?" Because I think I don't know
marketing right
I don't
there.
know if I have the funds for it, but we can check in.
I don't know. I don't know what his fee is for what would that be, about a 5-second soundbite?
We'll get somebody on it to